And hello again. Good to see you all. I'm back here in Portland, in this particular corner of our kitchen from which I actually led several Unitarian Universalist worship services on Sunday mornings. So this feels like a very sacred corner of the apartment to me. It's a good spot to be sitting to see you all on this evening. Okay, well, we're going to just get right to it here. We're talking about religious liberalism, and I'm going to bring up my document I want to share with you just to kind of capture the arc of what we're looking at. Where is share screen? Right there. And we're on week 2, where we're going to consider primarily questions about authority and tradition. And then the trajectory as currently planned, with the freedom I retain to change it at any time, depending on where our shared inquiry goes, would be to look at some particular figures next week, frankly, from my tradition, from the Unitarian side of things. And then also kind of conscious that a thing that's like barely discussed in these contexts sometimes is Christology. So I want to take a few minutes to talk about that. And Emerson and Parker and Channing will be good launching pads for us to consider that question. Week 4, the social gospel, which has been such a prominent part of religious liberalism. And then the final week, critiques of this tradition, which I think includes most of us who are here, and what might come of it in the future. That's where we are for the moment. So, and just wanted to lift something in front of you here as well, which was last week we broke out to consider what the meaning of the word liberal even was, if we were going to take the time to talk about liberal religion. And just a friendly reminder of some of the concepts that came up that I think help us understand this term, at least in this context. Primarily, of course, the very nature of the word, about freedom and liberty, which in a religious context usually means particularly the freedom of conscience to determine your own understanding of the Bible or Christ or God or any other thing. But accordingly, perhaps, or certainly flowing from that freedom, liberty, equality in political and social situations as well. That liberal religion is progressive, accepting of change, evolutionary. It looks to the future. That it involves a generosity of spirit and goods, as I recall us talking about it, such as helping others and protecting minorities, and broadly speaking, energy of curiosity, open-mindedness, non-literal or non-orthodox, at least not automatically orthodox, we might say, and in dialogue with modernity. So religion of that nature, which includes many traditions, is what we're talking about. Father Matt.
I just wanted to point out this, I think, a very interesting paradox about liberalism as it's historically been known, which is in this element of protecting minorities, there's a decidedly non-democratic feature of liberalism in the sense that it's not always up to the majority rule. Sometimes you have to have a minority, you have to have the rights of the minority protected from the will of the majority that might be inclined to take those rights away. So, for example, having a Supreme Court who will protect the rights of its citizens from the democratic process where the government might choose to deprive minorities of certain rights, and a justice system will say, no, you don't get to do that. And that's a function of liberalism. It's a caution, it's a word, it goes against democracy in its purest form sometimes.
Yes, that's an interesting point. This is the core, I think, point of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, as somebody might have mentioned last week as well. That because you have to more fundamentally trust dialogue and dialectic you have to protect minorities because there's always a chance they might turn out to be right in the end. I guess a question, Matt, would be, is that kind of thing seen within liberal religions? Can one think of examples within your tradition or mine or any other that might proclaim this mode where the powers that be do, in fact, officially protect
Yeah.
minority
Bishops.
points of view?
The bishops are known as defenders of the faith, and they are entrusted with a lifelong obligation to protect the traditions from the vagaries and whims of, ordinary humans who might come up with newfangled ideas that may not be in accordance to the traditions. So there's it's a conservative element, but it's a protective element of what's seen as an essential truth against the whims of the majority, the fads of the current moment. I don't know, maybe that's not liberalism actually, but kind of goes to the root of it anyway.
We will think about that and talk about it more later. All right. Well, we're already way up in our heads. At least that's how it feels to me. So let's get it back to our lived experience, which was one of the very root bases of this tradition that we talked about last time and that we'll spend a lot of time with this week. So you may have not had an experience that you quite described that way. Get as close to that as you can. Even see what you mean by these words or whatnot. And there will be no, undue sharing. Share to the extent you're comfortable here and when we come back. And this will give you a chance to know somebody a little bit better, because these are so frequently among the most meaningful experiences of people's lives. And there will be a group of 3 folks. And I'll leave you out there for 6 or 7 minutes, and please share the time politely. All you have to do is accept this invitation, and off you go. Just, kind of freeform, how was that? And in particular, did you notice anything in common among the stories that you shared? Where was their resonance, or perhaps disconnect for that matter? Just the things that stood out.
Within our group, and I think maybe even broader, it goes from the spectrum of being very profound and deep and almost mysterious to very basic and simple.
Thou art speaking profound truth. Any other observations? Yeah, Jim.
Two of ours had to do with nature, that the feeling came about through getting out into nature, being in nature, connection to nature.
Mm-hmm. And maybe extrapolating from that, I don't know if this was said, sort of the naturalness of the experience, right? If there's something it's just very real, very grounded. Other thoughts? I promise you this has to do with Friedrich Schleiermacher, so if that tempts you to share. Barbara.
I don't know who Friedrich is, but it also seemed to me that the experience was something that happened. It was unexpected. It wasn't planned or
Yeah. You don't get up in the morning and say, today I'm going to have that big spiritual experience I've been meaning to have all these years.
Right.
No matter what. Do you hear me? Though that doesn't hurt, which is, I guess, the ironic wonder of the whole thing. Some Zen teacher said, enlightenment is completely an accident, but meditation makes you accident prone. And so we might say God reveals God's self by grace, but it probably, opens the valves if you pray and ask for it. Bill.
I'm going to share what my new best friend, Barb, from our meeting was. I'm going to share it. She can elaborate, but she shared the insight that the moment, and whether it's not so much spiritual, but a profound thing was when someone she was visiting with voiced exactly what she had always thought or thought was important. And the resonance of that comment gave her that sudden, I think, and Barb, you can clarify, a very special feeling at least. And I like that. I had never thought about that that kind of a particular about having that reaction to a dialogue with someone I was talking to, for example.
Yeah, interesting.
That was well said, Bill. And I had another experience similar to the one that I talked with Bill about, where this other woman and I, who I had never met before, were having a discussion about animals. And we were both touched by what we were sharing. And what followed was this lovely, lovely silence. And we felt so connected in that silence. It was beyond words. And both of us reflected on that later in the larger group of what a spiritual, sacred silence that was.
So, I mean, both from words, in that something gets shared and this resonance gets felt in this immediate way, but then also what is revealed by the words is something that's beyond words. Frequently, such experiences are described, as non-dualistic, or as resolving paradoxes, or as all-inclusive, or as self-evident. It's just everything is all right there at the same time. I loved that first point, that from what seemed, what you would name as the very profound to what you would name as the very simple. And Zen in particular is full of stories, and so is William James' Varieties of Religious Experience, for that matter, of some fella who meditates for 20 years and he's chewing on it and he reads the Diamond Sutra and everything, and then one day in the garden a bird is like, and he's like, and everything those books were talking about is laid bare. And I think of some of my own experiences. It's just so wonderful that all of this resonance with everything that you've said. And your sharing, Bruce, before you even knew you were doing it, spoke to me most of all. I think the one of the most really salient spiritual experiences of my life left me with a feeling of such deep gratitude for even being alive for just that very moment, that it was like, oh my God, if I live even one more day, it will be a miracle. It'll be more than I need or deserve. And I've lived hundreds of days since then and wasted most of them. But, I still can touch that gratitude again. Well, lovely. I appreciate it so much that you would share in this way. And there is a class-oriented purpose to it to some extent, although talk about something that's kind of self-evident to me. This is like the main and most interesting thing to talk about ever. And I have asked us to do it to kind of get us grounded in our own experience, and particularly our experiences that we would describe as religious or spiritual. Because that is, in fact, I think you can argue, many have, that is the basis of this kind of whole thing that we describe as liberal religion. That the freedom and rights of individuals and of minorities, and the acceptance of change, all of that relates to our own fact of our own change and growth and reality of our conscience and our minds and our experiences. And that basis, you or me, and what we feel and understand about the world as the ultimate authority is one of the core foundations of religious liberalism. And this comes first, I guess, and thus foremost, from the aforementioned Friedrich Schleiermacher, who lived from 1768 to 1834. He was Lutheran, a German, and is frequently named as the father, it's always a father in these old stories, of modern liberal theology. And who wrote a couple of foundational books, one for the theologians called The Christian Faith, which, you know, talks about everything, and another one that they at least make folks who train for Unitarian ministry read, which is called On Speeches on Religion Toward Its Cultured Despisers, which is just one of the best titles ever. Which he wrote in the early 1800s at a time when Enlightenment thinking, the flourishing of the arts and humanistic thinking, and the renewed interest in Greek and Roman thought, which is to say non-church thought, that had, you know, kind of blossomed in the late 1600s and 1700s, had made its impact. And so very many people that Schleiermacher, highly educated fellow there, and was encountering, were coming to sort of dismiss religion, to ask many of the questions that anybody has ever asked about it. You know, on what basis do we believe this, and how does this accord with our newer understandings of the world? All those things I talked about last time: the geologic age of the earth, the scientific revolution, the beginnings of the industrial revolution, the Age of Enlightenment itself. All of those things had impacted educated folks, and Schleiermacher wanted to say something to them as to why religion, with a new definition, still mattered. And so he did some bold things, particularly in that book. He argued that the basis of religion fundamentally was not any of the things that we normally think of as their traditional authoritative base. That it was not, in the end, the Bible. It was not, in the end, the Christian tradition. It was not Jesus or his teachings. It was not anything that anybody had ever taught you using words. He said, quote, "Religion's essence is neither thinking nor acting, but intuition and feeling. Religion is born in a feeling in us that wishes to intuit the universe, wishes devoutly to overhear the universe's own manifestations and actions, longs to be grasped and filled by the universe's immediate influences in childlike passivity. Religion wishes to see the infinite, its imprint and its manifestation in humanity, no less than in all other individual and finite forms." How about I throw that in the chat if you want to read it? I mean, I don't know. This is, I can't remember the actual date of this, 1810 or something. One immediately notices that he's saying the universe and not God. That religion comes from an intuition that wants to intuit, you know, the whole, that he's clearly including the physical universe in. In fact, if not saying something like that whole universe is, that's all I'm talking about. Though he did not disavow the notion of God, preached on God, and so on. But he is, in this instance, speaking to those cultured despisers. Elsewhere, he, before I say that, before I offer this other quote, many times I've read people say that religion is born of people's yearning for meaning, inherent yearning for meaning that seems to be built into our humanness, maybe even physically, and our awareness of death. And those things go totally together. We're the one lucky species that knows we're going to die, and so we have to craft all of this meaning and ethics and everything in the light of that, because we understand our finitude, which is one of the things that lets us understand infinitude. And so that some have said, like, people became aware of death, and that's where religion was born. Oh, what's going to happen to us? I'm afraid. Can I be good or bad? Schleiermacher says, nope. And here's his quote, which now I'll share with you first so that it's easier to follow along with. He said, religion is the outcome neither of the fear of death nor of the fear of God. It answers a deep need in human beings. It is neither a metaphysic nor a morality, but above all and essentially an intuition and a feeling. Dogmas are not, properly speaking, part of religion. Rather, they are derived from it. Religion is the miracle of direct relationship with the infinite, and dogmas are the reflection of this miracle. That makes me think of, was her name Ruth or Rose from last week? I wish she were here right now. Who, when we talked about what was the point of religion, why do we choose to be religious, said maybe we don't have any choice at all. And here's Schleiermacher saying religion is the miracle of direct relationship with the infinite, which precedes any thought we might have about that. Similarly, belief in God and in personal immortality are not necessarily a part of religion. One can conceive of a religion without God, and it would be pure contemplation of the universe. The desire for personal immortality, which the whole thing of heaven and hell was one of the main things that the cultured despisers would have nothing to do with, as is so often the case today, he said that whole scheme seems rather to show a lack of religion, since religion assumes a desire to lose oneself in the infinite rather than to preserve one's own finite self. Any thoughts or reactions to that? It seems so radical when you think of it being written in 1800 or something, and yet so many would just say, yeah, absolutely, 100%. Michael.
Well, I wonder, when you use universe and you use the infinite, that seems like a paradox we could live with, but the universe is finite. It's just immense, right? But is there a contradiction there? It doesn't seem like there's, for our purposes, there is, but that's what I was wondering.
The current take on the universe is that it is infinite, or at least infinite in its possibilities and capacities, is my understanding from cosmology.
But I mean, I think that's a good point Michael's making about it. I don't know if that was the understanding that Schleiermacher might have had, that, I think the universe was a discrete sphere of reality that, yeah, I think that's because that's the difference between, of course, pantheism and panentheism, right? Is there something beyond the total of the parts? But not to get, I personally love that definition. I just copied it and sent it to my girlfriend. I like it so much.
Okay, high praise indeed.
Chris?
Yes.
Hi. Schleiermacher, give us again the general time frame that he lived.
1768 to 1834.
Okay, because I was going to say that you read that first quote of his, which was beautiful. The immediate thing that came to my mind were the romantic poets.
He is a figure himself in German Romanticism.
That doesn't surprise me, because broadness or universalism, ode to the intimacy of immortality and so forth. It connects.
Yeah. Also a deep like awareness of, love of, and harmony with nature, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Bill.
Is the last sentence of the second quote sounded to me a little bit like Buddhist thought? Isn't that concept of losing ultimately in nirvana is to lose yourself completely to?
Absolutely. Yeah, that is a much more.
I bet he didn't know that much about Buddhism back then.
No, but if the I mean, we didn't get into this in our earlier discussion, but you know, a common feature of experiences that people describe as spiritual or religious is either like the sort of the disappearance of the self or an awareness of its relative lack of importance, the willingness to give it up, as Bruce described, like, what's that, you know, compared to this, or the expansion of the self. Like, oh my God, my mind actually goes farther than the stars I can see. It goes at least as far as the stars I can see because I see them. My mind is almost by definition at least that big. And in both of those things, little ego, whatever, gone. And I do appreciate it. I'm struck by, you know, this notion that treating religion as primarily making sure that you, Chris, is on the right side as opposed to the wrong side of the final destination wherein which I, Chris, get to live forever is antithetical in some ways. You know, preserving one's own finite self. I mean, I guess there's, you know, we're there for 10,000 years singing praises and so forth, but that actually sounds boring. I'd rather be absorbed into the cosmic whole, personally. So yeah, and it would also be something, in fairness, that you would find in the Christian mystic tradition, or in the Jewish mystic tradition as well. That even with the apparent, you know, self and other of God and humanity and whatnot, it appears that the common quality of mystical, spiritual, religious experiences is either the expansion of the self into irrelevancy or the disappearance of it through its shrinking or lack of importance. So one suspects this fella had some personal experience. Did I see your hand, Sherry?
Yes. Are you familiar with Greta Vosper?
No.
She's minister in the United Church of Canada, and she has written a book called With or Without God. In essence being really that we do know within ourselves how we should live, whether or not we relate that to God.
Right.
And she's written liturgies that reflect that different approach. Very interesting person.
Cool. What's her last name?
Vosper, Vosper, Greta.
With or Without God, Greta Vosper. That's for everybody who wants to look it up there. Thank you. Okay. If I may then, just a couple other words about Schleiermacher. That's really a huge piece of his legacy, I guess you would say. But some of the other things that you saw in those quotes that are also significant, and why he might be called the father of religious liberalism, is that by placing the ultimate authority in personal experience or awareness or some personal relationship between God and you or me, that made, as he clearly described, religion not, or at least very less, tied to any traditional manifestation or authority. That he said you could have religion without dogma. Dogma comes from what he's calling religion, which is experience, not the other way around. So that anything then church, even scripture, that gets called religion, in the modern lingo, maybe opposed to spiritual, he says is essentially limited. It's a human construct. And that's why there's some over there in Germany and some over there in Spain and something completely different over there in India, because these are human-generated things like art or culture or poetry or language. And in that form, they are limited things. He's trying to tell his friends, these culture despisers, all that stuff can still have value, right? All of that stuff might still accomplish goods, even if we acknowledge, okay, it got made up along the way by people who were trying their best. And he can come to that kind of conclusion, as many folks who would identify as religiously liberal might, because, you know, he's open to what we might call a scientific or analytical approach to religion itself. If you study the history of the church thoroughly, you have to acknowledge that, like, wow, people thought really different things at different times, like really different things. All which it makes perfect sense, because, you know, you got to think certain things in the Iron Age, and you got to think certain things in the modern technological age because of what we have around us and what we can understand. So, you know, he's saying, let's look at it closely. Let's even look at the Bible closely, and, you know, we can come to some conclusions out of that. So it's an interesting insight that I find hard to deny, but it's actually really threatening to a lot of people, right? Because it draws into question or critique or invites outright rebellion against traditional teachings and understandings of the role of the Bible, the church itself, all of the culture that built up in relation to the Bible and the church, and so on. And so this leads us then to kind of one of the, you know, the core pieces, I think, of religious liberalism, is this critical consideration of the sources of authority. And I'm putting there in the chat some of those that I mentioned, but also, you know, some of the others. And this is kind of where I want us to have just some open conversation now a little bit. So you can, you know, so Schleiermacher and many who would follow after him say, you know, the Bible is a wonderful record. It's a beautiful tool. It's an important thing, but is it the ultimate source of authority compared to direct insight or direct awareness or one's personal relationship with God or Christ or whatever? What is the role of the church? All of these are places that we normally, you know, might turn to as authorities. Even those of us who think that in fact our ultimate authority is our own personal self are still going to perhaps ask, well, what would my family think about that? You know, science, nature, etc., etc. I've just kind of dumped these all on you as possible sources of authority. Matthew.
When I was a chaplain at the university, I had to keep in the forefront of my mind that my authority was earned. It was never assumed. I could not walk into a room full of 20-year-old kids and assume that just because I had a collar on, you know, they were going to give me any credence whatsoever. I had to earn my authority with them. And just so, you know, the Bible earns its authority with me, as occasionally and often it speaks to my soul in a very profound way and changes my life and my outlook. And same with church. It's not an authority that's granted by nature of being church, so much as I've had experiences in church that have driven me into prayer and God and truth in ways that have changed my life therefore I allow it authority in my life, but that doesn't mean I'm uncritical of it. And in fact, I never lose my responsibility to be a grown-up in the middle of it all and make my own choices about what is right and what's wrong, etc. So I think it's that it's that exchange, it's that relationship with the other source of authority that creates authority. You know, it's the experience, as Schleiermacher would say, it's the experience you have with church, with Bible, with culture that will grant authority to that source. Does that make sense?
Yeah, if it affirms or denies your own experience, though that kind of strips it of any deeper level of authority or any in its own right, right? Which makes me wonder about your earlier statement. So you're still saying, you know, I am making a fundamental choice to be connected to this tradition, right? So, right? That the choice is yours. That you're granting your church authority over you. Is that fair?
What I mean by that is that I am willing to subject myself to the church's teachings in the hopes that the church is going to continue as it has in the past, continue to enlighten me and inform me, move me and change me. And I'm also so totally aware that that's a choice I'm making, you know, and a choice I can withhold if I want.
Mm-hmm. Here in the modern age, where one doesn't have to be Lutheran simply because our local prince is. And not to mention not having to go to war against the neighboring prince because he insists on being Catholic. Yeah. And yet earlier, interestingly, you noted that the bishops have a role, an authoritative role, to preserve the tradition. And so that's the first of what will be unfold as of many tensions that are inherent in this process. And there's no escaping them, right? I mean, you're welcome to go have your complete individual authority. Most humans these days in the world, and particularly America, do. They're just like, I don't want to have anything to do with any of that. I do whatever I want. But as soon as you relate to any of these things, right, these relational tensions are created.
Yeah, it's like any love relationship. We subject ourselves to the other in a love relationship, and we willingly subject ourselves then to the ways that the other can hurt us, abuse us, break our hearts, as the church has done for hundreds of years. And yet, you know, that's not the whole story.
Right. Bruce, I see your hand.
I like this raising the concept of authority, because to trust in authority, it means you trust. And I think that's the crux of the issue here is, what is it you trust? You know, like a child trusts their parent or whatever. And it strikes me that we look at our own experience, you know, that great phrase, lived experience. And one can't help but wonder, can I trust myself? And that's what I think where maybe the Bible is a great help, because it gives us such a range, such a big God. Now, some people might say he's a small God, but I guess that's how you read the Bible. To me, it's a big God. And I think this is something I can trust more than I can even trust my own lived experience or the big universe or whatever.
I mean, that's a very deep and fundamental question. And can you or do you trust yourself? Even the
Yeah.
answer you might give to that question could largely depend on what authoritative tradition you had come out of.
Yes, and if I were, if I had a father that abused me, I may not think much of the God of the Bible, I suppose. But at any rate, just that issue of how we look at authority is critical.
Yeah. I mean, it's a wonderful point. I have, directly met people whose understanding of themselves, largely because of their religious views, their, particular, in this case, in my mind, Christian religious views, that no, the teaching was I'm fundamentally sinful. I will always do what, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. I make wrong choices all the time.
Yeah.
Jesus saved me because I was a drunkard and a licentious fiend. And when I was in charge, I was a mess. When I put Jesus in charge, I stopped being a mess. So I am fundamentally untrustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have that kind of point of view, what then would you make of your own, personal experience? Except, of course, a good religious liberal would say that whether they name it or not, that person is having a personal experience of having been transformed by Christ in whom they're placing all their trust. And isn't it fascinating that, down to the level of whether or not you even trust your own eyes and ears is a way that people can differ. No wonder we can't get along. Barb and then Barbara.
I was going to say that I've had a totally different experience having been a member, not currently, of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, with their dogma, which does not resonate with me. And I trust my own experience to say that just is wrong. That just is wrong. I don't believe it. It doesn't resonate with me. I find it offensive. Goodbye.
Yeah. Not alone in that experience either. Barbara, did you have something? I'm sorry.
Well, originally, I'm trying to make sense of this. My head is making so many different connections. I'm trying to think clearly about this, which maybe I just have to abandon that. But
yeah, do think out loud for us. It'll be better.
one of the things that you talked about earlier were people that might not be open to changing their minds about something. I do think that we all need to be grounded in some belief system. But there are some people who have developed the ability to step out of that belief system and experience other things and come back. They're always testing against that, and they feel the freedom to do that. There are other people who don't. And my question was around what is it that creates that? And I asked that question because I think that is part of the reason why we have a society where there are more people who are polarized from it.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I have hope that things can be different. So, and I'm glad you brought in this idea of authority, because my background is so strongly rooted in science and education that when I have no doubt that every atom that is a part of me will continue in this world, just because of the concept that matter can't be created or destroyed, and that every cell of my body has been replaced every 7 years. So now at my age, that's 10 times in a lifetime. And so there's part of me that doesn't have any doubt about that. And then there's that part of me that still wonders.
Wonders what?
Not about the cell part, but about, you know, what happens to the soul? What happens?
Yeah. No. What of the part of you that you know without denial has been you through all of those changes you just described?
mhm,
There used to be a Barbara with entirely different atoms,
right.
but there's you. I mean, like, you're insane if you literally if you can't accept that there's a you-ness that was then and is now.
Mhm.
I guess the question is, is that a smaller finite thing, or is that an expression of a universal thing? And most mystic teaching would say, that thus in the end, your soul is part and parcel with whatever name we want to give to the complete infinitude, right? That's the thing that lasts, and you're it, and
Mhm.
it's you. The that earlier point is so profound. There are people who, this is a fact, we see this, we know these folks, we're related to them or married to them. There are some people who have just concrete understandings of the world. There's some people who just see things in the way they were taught, and it adequately explains the whole world. And my church and my mom told me it's true, and that's good enough for me. And guess what? Those people can grow up to lead nations. That's not a fundamentally defective quality of humanness. You can succeed in our current world with it. Increasingly, thanks to technology and globalization and all these other sorts of things, it becomes harder to hold that. But it works. It has worked up until now. And then there are other folks who, by some chance of the size of their minds, or open-minded people around them, or reading the right book at the right time, or God invading their space, or dropping acid, or whatever, realized, like, oh, I can look at myself and my views and my beliefs. And that is, in fact, like almost a developmental difference. Many people, educators and whatnot, would speak of those in developmental terms. And it's tricky to not then think like this is better than that. They're just two realities of being human. And my understanding is the only way to possibly transform folks in this level is just to gently and kindly invite them to see things differently without any attachment to the outcome, because they're happy to keep succeeding in the way that they did and have.
Mhm.
And boy, that's hard. And it gets particularly hard in times of great strife, like where we live now, when some of the people who are over on this side are mean about it, like want to fight you for it. And then what do you do? Father Matt.
And I think there's a bigger picture outside of that. In my own life, where I've worked with lots of people with different abilities, that their brain is not built the same way. And that it's not either that you're smart or not smart, but that, I can think of some brilliant children who are considered autism as a label, who had the most amazing ways of thinking and looking at the world that I didn't see. It was my job to try to figure out, what are they communicating to me? What's that puzzle? Sometimes it was very simple. Sometimes, like, take my glasses. If I wouldn't have my glasses on, they'd say, "Put on your glasses, Mrs. Milliken. Put your glasses on." They would do that. That was where they had difficulty moving away, but they did have really different ways of perceiving things. And before this class tonight, I attended a lecture through Oregon State of a neurologist or a neuroscientist, who was talking about how some parts of our brain, a lot of it's just built in, like the early development, certain things are just built in and they don't change. Your
Right.
brain's super flexible and it can change. But maybe some of those things, you're right. I like your idea of gently encouraging, because, or just acceptance.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the real challenge. Can you just love things the way they are without needing to change them? It's that's a really important point for any person, I think, any of us, to even think about ourselves, the way that our childhood experiences, particularly adverse childhood experiences, trauma, whatever it means, or it might be the body keeps the score, as the book says, that actually, if depending on, no matter how smart you are or what happens to you or whatever, you get raised with a lack of ability to trust grown-ups around you for the first 3 years of your life. You got some hardcore wiring issues that it's going to take, I don't know what, God's grace, to help you overcome. Matt?
And I love this conversation, and it really seems to, so much of this question of authority has to do with trauma, like what traumas have we carried or experienced that lead us to reject certain elements or conversation partners in our lives. I think of so many people traumatized by religion who are just like, that's it, I'm done, period. And it strikes me as like, well, I was abused by my uncle, therefore I'm never going to hear anything that my grandfather on my mother's side ever has to say. I have nothing to learn from anybody in my family because my uncle abused me.
Right.
And I see that happen again and again and again, where because of our trauma, we can't trust. And as a result, we're closing ourselves off from what can be authentic sources of wisdom, whether it's in our tradition, in scripture, family, love relationships, wherever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's that healing of the trauma that is so fundamental to the question of what you find authoritative.
Mm-hmm. 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 Any other thoughts on sources of authority? I might have sent us out into small groups, but this is a good size. I'm just going to keep us here talking with each other, okay? Please, Jim, I saw your hand.
I'd like to make the comment that having relatives in what people would call authoritative religions, there is a sense of relief that they don't have to worry about deep things, because now they've found someone who can answer all their questions with simplistic answers. And that can be a real relief for some people. And then if that's challenged, they just retreat into their in-group because they've already made that decision and they're not going to go back and try to rethink it. So, and then back in that in-group, they find strength and go out again. But back to, there was an author in the 1950s, Erich Fromm, trying to figure out why the Nazis were the Nazis. And his book was Escape from Freedom, which was basically touching on the fact that people don't want too much freedom. It's too much of a burden for some people. And they're willing to give up that authority to somebody who could just make them feel calm.
Yeah. Yeah. I just read some essays by Alan Watts this last week by chance. And he was writing in 1960 in this particular instance. And he repeatedly used a phrase like the age of anxiety. And he spoke of the crippling anxiety and guilt that modern, humanity finds itself in. And that sort of got me to thinking, okay, yeah, well, that was probably nothing new, and it goes all the way back to Freud, right? And before that, and is magnified by the existentialists and the whole first part of the 20th century. I mean, in many ways, a direct result of all this stuff we're actually talking about. Biblical criticism, historical literary thinking, science, as all of these previous ways of authority get completely shaken up, people are scared and they don't know what to turn to. And, I mean, it's not like, I think the existentialists got a lot right. But compared to Buddhists who come to many of the same conclusions, they did not seem at all happy about it. I mean, it's like no one wishes they could be more like Albert Camus, really. Maybe they do. But, there's so much struggle, so much, lonely grappling for some shred of meaning from an absurd universe. When you put all of that together, can anyone blame anybody for, like, you know what? I just found a good teacher. He tells me what to do. I go to work. I'm putting these blinders on because actually and this would be a Zen response too. Like, well, stop thinking about all that shit. Just do the work in front of you and live a simple human life and, embrace what's real. But sometimes that, of course, the fact is what's real is so vast that it'll blow your mind. And so you just want to, and what a thing to think of Nazism as this, gut level response to the horrifying anxiety of all of that openness and freedom. It puts it in some context. I appreciate that point. Michael.
Earlier on, you used this key word, non-duality. And when I listen to this conversation, I think of, for me, non-duality is often a marriage of opposites or a union of opposites. But we're not really thinking of liberal as one polarity that would be balanced by what? I think we're all liberals, but I think you could say there is a positive counterpole in tradition or something that we're tending to demonize when we associate it with anxiety. And we see that even more exaggerated in politics today than in the church, where it seems like when I was thinking about this class last week, I thought, I wonder if anybody's ever called Chris too liberal. Well, I don't think any of us here find you too liberal, but that must be out there. I've heard that all my life. So-and-so is too liberal. Now, what would that mean?
Yeah. Well, what have you taken it to mean when people have accused you of it?
Accused me of it?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know that anybody has, but no one's ever accused me of being conservative either. But well, I lost the thread. It seemed like the idea of liberalism, if you associate it with progressivism, it's aiming towards something, and it's leaving, say, the traditional model behind. But I don't know exactly what it would be aiming toward ultimately. What's its Marxist state or whatever? Not politically, but what's its eschaton? What are you striving for?
That is a great question, and we'll devote a whole class to that.
Okay.
To the notion of progress, kingdom on earth, the social gospel. Can the world even be improved at all? My sense of what people mean when they say someone is too liberal, is that, as you said, and actually, let me just, sorry, trapped in my head here. All of this is a tension between seeming opposites, right? And of course you can go too far in one direction or another. And so, too liberal means so open to the fact and possibility of other points of view as to have none of any substance of one's own. or to treat everything as completely relative, morally relative, or to so dispense with tradition that you think we should just have anarchy or something like that. And the reason I got caught in my head is because I actually have a whole list of the tensions inherent in this conversation, and I'm going to post them in the chat right now after I rebut Father Matt and his side conversation there. So what all of these reveal
I hear a kitty.
you do.
Okay.
There are two who live here,
Okay.
and they are feeling very frisky right now. I guess I could have shared my screen too, but I'd rather look at your faces, so I'm using the chat. I don't know if you get to see the chat, Bruce, so I'll just read what I posted. In any of these conversations then about authority or any other thing, there's a tension between the authoritative role of the individual and their rights versus the authoritative role of the community and theirs. Is wearing a mask a violation of my personal freedom or an appropriate gesture of my concern for the common good? I wrote progressive versus conservative. I might seek a better word than conservative, but just inherent. Are things getting better? Can they? Is change good or bad, trustworthy or untrustworthy? How much of the past should we ever hang on to? Does it still have some use? Schleiermacher wanted to say, hey, frankly, you all say, we can sing the old hymns, we can recite the old creeds, we can invoke the old symbols and participate in the ancient rite of Eucharist or any other. We can think of them differently, but if we hang on to them, maybe we'll get something to gain from them, whereas many other folks along the way have said, no thanks, don't need it anymore. For me, we have barely touched on it. It might be too much to introduce now, but once you get to Schleiermacher, then even God apparently becomes like a concept that we're actually talking about, something that stands in for a deeper, more experiential level of reality. And at what point do you, in a way, talk yourself out of the efficacy of these things by treating them just as ideas rather than real things? I can't tell you how many horrible Unitarian sermons I've heard where we're taught that the concept of God helps to orient us to deeper moral truths or this, that, or the other thing. Well, I'll tell you, when I can't decide what to do next in my tortured life, I don't want to pray to a concept. I want the living God to show up and offer some assistance. How do you have that, without making a leap of faith that some call absurd? Even this notion of individual authority. Is it up here or is it down here? Is a conversation we could have for 90 minutes or more. And then accordingly, and we'll get more into this when we get into the social gospel, okay, so is the point of religion changing the world and affecting our circumstances? We haven't really gotten into this yet, compared to cultivating that inner experience that we've most concentrated on. And thus, this tension between spiritual and religious, or as Matt notes, the progressive and tragic views of history. Another way of that's that progressive versus conservative. Is that what you were getting at? Right. Yeah, good. Thank you. And I'm sure we'll see others. Any thoughts about any of that? Barbara.
I don't know if this connects to this piece, but I was thinking about some of the recent neuroscience that basically says most of our major life decisions we make without consciously thinking about it. We're like on autopilot.
Yeah.
And this is more about the beginning I think, part of the discussion about how we perceive God or where religion comes from. But one of the interesting points of this, what not today's lecture, but that I heard, but another one was they compared our modern culture to our more modern culture to a tribe of people that still live, our hunter-gatherers live from the land, and that fight or flight, a lot of those basic instincts work well for that tribe, but they do not work well for how we have evolved as humans. And I'm not thinking about evolution as necessarily better than the tribes, the way those tribal people live, but I think there are some things that are working against us that are harder for us to sort through. And some of it, even as we're talking, to me, they're the labels, the words we use. So the term progressive to me means, is it really progressive, or is it really caring about the affairs of everyone in the world who are suffering?
And might not that be an incredibly conservative point of view?
Yeah.
Wasn't there a famous teacher from Galilee some couple of millennia ago who said something about everybody being included and loving everybody? I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't remember his name. But I do think, and I find it really distorting to be my age and hear people talk about the reality of 20 years ago when I'm thinking about the reality of longer than that, and how many things have not changed.
It's amazing. I'm telling you right now, if you read Schleiermacher's Defense of Religion Against Its Cultured Despisers, other than the florid language and the 3 or 4 extra clauses per sentence, it's like, it's now. It's just talking about now. I was reading some John Dewey related to this. It's just, other than the old-timey language, it's like, holy mackerel, it's the same old thing. The Watts could have been, he's worried about television as far as technological impact and alienation and the elevation of the self and selfishness. It's like, dude, you don't even know. And yet it reads so now. I'm not sure whether to be, I guess at a gut level, I don't know about how it affects you, Barbara. In a weird way, I draw some comfort from it, because it's like they also all wrote as though the whole thing was going to fall apart in any second now. And here we are having the same old argument, plus still watching baseball, we're
Right.
that mellow about it. So, I don't know.
Well, when I was working in the schools, there was a great quote I like to share with staff about this new technology that was, going to destroy everything in the classroom, and it was the pencil. It's a quote about the pencil. So I think, change is constant, growth is inevitable.
Right. Yeah.
And growth is optional. Sorry. Change is constant, growth is optional.
There you go. Yeah, that's it. For each of us and the whole species.
Right.
Yeah.
So in many ways, liberal means more to me, not in a political sense, liberal, conservative, but maybe having more possibilities or looking at more possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, maybe just that. The ability or the willingness or the freedom to consider other possibilities. And I mean, it's hard not to think that's the better way to go. And then I guess the rub is to continue loving everybody who's around us, right now, just as they are. Even the ones who don't want to play that game.
And I don't know that it's the better way to go. It's just, for me personally, I feel like my life is richer because of that.
Yeah.
But that's, for me, that's just my own judgment for myself, not anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. I think it's useful. I mean, I don't want to. What do I want to say? So in this class I took on human development with Robert Kagan, I kind of broke this down into these different stages of like fundamental human development. And it was mostly about the capacity of our minds to grapple with ever more, not just abstract, but also ungraspable notions, or basically to grapple, like, how much possibility could you hold? And there were, children and their whole Piaget development and everything. They're just ultra concrete or whatever. And then there's adults who see things in really concrete forms, and then gradual opening. And he placed at the top of the list only a handful of folks, at least who were alive at the time. The Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh. He was naming, Desmond Tutu, people whose hearts and minds were clearly so large that they could hold the whole thing, good and evil, and any other thing. I'd put Richard Rohr in this category, right? They've got the whole world in their hands. But then the rub is how not to think that anything less than the Dalai Lama, you're only getting a B or a C in the class. You're not going to get an A. How do you not judge these as stages or as better than, And I guess part of the rub is that one of the qualities of what he named the highest stage is that your heart holds everybody already right now. And you don't need anybody to go from stage 2 to stage 3 because it's going to make the world a better place or something like that. And yet, one thing that seems true is I have to think about this. At least for me, once you have the fundamental insight that other people who are raised in different places with different authoritative teachings and languages are inevitably going to see the world differently from you and just as certain of its rightness. Once you realize, well, if I'd been born in India, I'd be a Hindu, me, I don't know how you can ever go back from that. It would be a weird thing to say, I can't handle the freedom anymore. I'm going to go, but geez, as we lifted up early, all of Germany made that choice. Because actually in the late 1800s, Germany was considered the most enlightened and open-minded nation on the continent, including with the best and most open-hearted relationship to its Jewish population. And so, I guess here I am thinking out loud. I guess we can always go backwards. All right. Good juice. We're almost done. Sherry, lay it on us. Can't hear you.
I remember a seminar where at a college where we were teaching once, and the presenter said that the research showed that the typical churchgoer does not want to think beyond the 5th grade level, regardless of whether they were professional people, whatever. When they were in church, they did not want to think beyond that level, and that is so difficult.
And I guess that means you and me too, right? I mean, it was basically all of us. keep it simple. Is apparently a very deep urge. Yeah. Well, and I can attest as a UU minister that if if you're constantly needing to make space for other points of view, it gets very hard to say anything at all. You're spending all your time reading the fine print under the signature rather than the contract itself. All right, well, on that lovely point, I'm going to put some links in the chat. And Matt, I can get these to you if you don't cut and paste here, so that they can go out via the email as well. Optional reading between now and next time would be to consider one or more, it's up to you, of these famous sermons that were published for my consumption as a divinity school student in a book called 3 Prophets of Religious Liberalism by Conrad Wright, who taught at Harvard for 95 years and compiled this book. And he thought, and he was a wonderful and interesting person, that these 3, at least from the perspective of his Unitarianism, were among the most central expressions of religious liberalism in the 1800s. And they're still juicy. They also will bear the hallmarks of the language of the day. And if you know your Emerson, you're going to have to sit there and chew a little bit to figure out what he's talking about. Chanting is clearer. And this Baltimore sermon is sometimes called Unitarian Christianity, and it's a good explication of where those early 1800s liberals were coming from, and it'll help us with the Christology conversation. There was more of that in there. And Parker's just a beautiful and radical writer, and this sermon got him thrown out of the Unitarian circles. It was so radical. And it still is a very beautiful sermon, I think. So pick one, pick more. Don't read any if you don't want to. I'll do my best to reference them. About as much as I referenced your homework from the last session, which is to say, not at all, apparently. I hope you enjoyed that article by Ames. It was a little heady, a little dense, but it did, I hope, just give a sense of the landscape that he was considering there in the 30s. Okay, so do that as you see fit, and I hope you enjoy them, and we'll talk about those and other things when we come back next time.